Hello and welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Avery. I'm 25 years old and today's video is going to be all about how I calculate my emergency fund. Let's talk about what an emergency fund is. Broadly speaking, an emergency fund is exactly how it sounds. It is money that you set aside in case of an emergency. It is not typically in the stock market. It's not in a retirement account. It's usually in a liquid account such as a high yield savings account. Do you need an emergency fund? Yes, everybody needs an emergency fund. Whether you are just out of college or midway through your career with a family and kids, you need an emergency fund. You never know when disaster might strike or when anything out of the ordinary may come up that you did not financially prepare for. Why I've been thinking about my emergency fund recently is I have been looking through my finances and trying to figure out how I can optimize them in this year. And what that got me down the rabbit hole on is all about emergency funding. So currently I do have an emergency fund. It is about $8,000. I do have other savings through sinking funds, but the money that is set aside specifically for an emergency is only about $8,000. For me, this does cover a decent amount of my expenses if I were to lose my income, but I knew for this year that one of my goals was to increase my emergency fund. However, I did not want to just pick a number out of thin air. I really wanted to think long and hard about how much it actually needed to be and what amount made sense and would cover the most potential amount of emergencies. Often with your emergency fund, you usually aren't seeing multiple emergencies at once, but it is good to essentially level up your game or level up your savings by having multiple contingency plans in place. And ultimately what that means when it comes to setting aside money for an emergency is that you set aside more money, at least the way I think about it. So this got me thinking about different methods and strategies on how much you should save for your emergency fund. The typical suggestion is 3 to 6 months of your monthly expenses. However, when I have been looking across YouTube, I consume a lot of financial content and I do follow the money guys. Their names are Brian and Bo, and they talk about what's called the financial order of operations. For this year, I have been trying to focus a bit more strategically by following their financial order of operations. So what does that actually mean? And how does that relate to creating your emergency fund? For these guys, what they do for the financial order of operations is step 1, you must have your deductibles covered. Your deductibles are for things like your insurance, so such as medical, auto, things like that. 2, you want to make sure you are reaching the employer match. So if your company has a 401k, you want to make sure you're contributing at least up to the match because that is free money. And I like to think of it as money that is essentially part of your salary. So if you are not contributing up to the employer match, you are essentially giving yourself a pay cut. And that's how I like to think about it. 3, you want to make sure that you are paying off any high interest debt. So things like credit cards or personal loans that carry a high balance, anything that carries a high interest is what you need to make sure you are paying off. And then 4 is where we come in, and it's the emergency reserves. Emergency reserves is money that you have set aside for any sort of emergencies. And I'm going to stop there for now because that is about where I'm at in the financial order of operations. I want to make sure I am having an adequate emergency fund. So I'm going to go over here and I'm going to actually check off everything I have done, and then we'll get into how I'm actually calculating it. For starters, I do have enough money in my $8,000 to cover my deductibles. I will get into the specifics on those shortly, but let's go ahead and check that off. At my job, I have a 10% automatic contribution to a pension retirement system, so I'm definitely reaching the employer match, and they match 14% of that. So I'm going to click that off. After that, I do not have any high interest debt, so I can check this off. I don't have any credit cards. I don't have like a high interest car loan. I don't have any personal loans. I don't have anything that would be considered high interest debt. I do have student loans, about $19,000, and they're all federal student loans. So the interest rate is not particularly high. So it's not my focus at the moment. So I'm not considering it part of high interest debt. And then finally, my emergency reserves. This is what I'm working on. So we're going to go ahead and go through here, and I'm going to calculate how much I actually need to save when it comes to my emergency fund. When I was thinking about my insurance types, I was thinking about my auto insurance, my medical, my pet insurance, and I have renter's insurance. So all of these have a deductible attached to them. So I want to make sure I'm actually saving enough money to cover these deductibles. Depending on what type of insurance you have, for auto, you may or may not have comprehensive and collision. I have a 2017 car and I prefer to have comprehensive and collision on them. So I do have this coverage. And for each of these, the deductible is $500. So I'm going to add that in. And then getting down to my medical insurance, this is where things kind of get a bit tricky for me. So currently I am on my father's insurance and I do have a deductible and an out-of-pocket max associated with them. However, I'm going to be changing insurances soon, and my new insurance is going to be slightly higher for both the deductible and the out-of-pocket max. So I am preparing or saving in preparation for this new insurance. So all that to be said, the deductible is $550 and then the out-of-pocket max is $3,000, but the deductible should count towards the out-of-pocket max. So I should only need to do $2,450. I think I did the math right. Just something I want to pause on here is technically in their financial order of operations, they don't say anything about the out-of-pocket max. They just talk more about covering your deductibles. For me though, I do have a chronic health condition, so more often than not, I'm hitting the out-of-pocket max every year. So I want to make sure that I'm actually covering for it, and it'll give me a peace of mind. Just simply covering my deductible would not do for me. I do have some thoughts about this covering your medical deductible though. What I want to say about this is often when you have an emergency, most people are thinking about a job loss, so an income loss. Here in the United States, so much of your insurance is tied to your employment. So I don't really know how effective saving for your deductible and your out-of-pocket max based off of your specific insurance will necessarily be for you if you lose that job and lose that insurance. So that's something to keep in mind. However, like, it's something to strive for, it's something to shoot for, and ultimately it'll give you more security than if you saved nothing. That's kind of how I like to think about it. So like, I know like if I had a job loss, I probably would end up with worse insurance than what I have now. Typically that's what I find on the healthcare marketplace. I do work for a public institution, so the insurance isn't terrible. It's considered better than most, but I know a lot of insurances on healthcare.gov, for example, are a lot higher with their deductible and their out-of-pocket max. But I can't really plan for the unknown. I can only plan for what I know, and that's why I decided to base it off of my current insurance. But that is just some thoughts I had on saving for that category. Speaking of more thoughts, my pet insurance, I do have a deductible of $250. I'm gonna put that in here, but ultimately for pet insurance, how a lot of it works is that you are paying, even when you hit the deductible, you are often paying for pet medical expenses up front and getting reimbursed. So you really do have to have the money on hand in order for you to eventually get reimbursed for it. Keeping that in mind, one of my super long-term goals would be to eventually have a pet emergency fund. I do have a dog, so that's why I'm saving for this. Even though I cover the deductible, I should have basically it's like a cash flow account, I guess, that would cover any sort of expenses that come in and out based off of the pet insurance, if that makes sense. Finally, I do rent. I am a renter, so there is rental insurance on my property that I rent, and the deductible is $500. So I'm gonna put that in here. That brings me to a total for my deductibles for $4,750. Personally, I have a tendency to round up, so I probably will just round this up mentally in my mind to $5,000, but let's table that for now. Now let's talk about my monthly expenses. So I'm going to calculate this both for what 1 month of expenses typically is, and then what 3 months would be and what 6 months would be. When I was deciding what expenses I should cover in this emergency fund calculation, I was trying to think about what bills actually have to get paid every single month, and then I was also trying to build in a bit more of a buffer room. So in my current budget, I do try to fund different sinking funds, which are kind of short-term accounts or short-term saving that I end up often spending from throughout the year. It's not like a long-term savings goal. However, I know for my emergency fund, or if I was in an emergency and had a job loss, I know that I would cut back quite a bit on my spending, and I would probably delay or defer as much as I can in spending wise until I have my income situation sorted out. So I really had to consider what expenses are actually being paid on a monthly basis, or what expenses I have to pay throughout the year, and then build in a bit of a buffer room for things like medical expenses and auto expenses. And when I say medical expenses, I mean I have a chronic health condition and I do buy some medical supplies out of pocket that aren't covered by insurance. That is why it's separate from the deductible area. And then with auto, oftentimes you have auto expenses that are not related to being in an accident. So just routine oil changes, car tire stuff, things like that is ones I want to just kind of try and build into my budget if I can. That being said, some things that are normally my budget, if you watch my budget with me videos, are not being included here, such as like my spend classes and like fun money, things like that, because if I am having an income issue, I'm probably not spending money on an expensive spin studio, or I'm probably not doing a lot of fun things that cost money. So that is some background info, but let's go ahead and get into calculating this. So for my rent, I live with my boyfriend in a 2-bedroom, 1-bathroom apartment. It does have relatively cheap rent and there's no utility expenses related to it, so I don't have to worry about calculating that into my emergency fund. But if you live somewhere where you have to pay monthly utilities, you definitely want to keep that in mind, but that's why you're not seeing it in mine. So I'm going to do $6.73 because I do pay just about this much. I'm rounding it up to the nearest dollar, so $6.73 is what I'm going to do. And I have this set up. I'm so proud of this because I'm not big on like Excel formulas or anything like that, but I have it set up to where it calculates the 3 and the 6 month for each expense. So for rent, 3 months would be worth $2,019 and 6 months would be $4,038. My phone bill, I currently have Straight Talk. It is $49 a month, rounding up. Often though, if I have been considering switching to Mint Mobile, so it is possible that if I were to have job loss, I would probably just go ahead and switch my phone plan to something cheaper. For food, in my current budget, I split this up between coffee, dining out, and just groceries. However, I'm just gonna, for the ease of calculating this, I'm going to do a just combined amount, and with the understanding that if I had an emergency situation, I'm probably not dining out quite a bit. So I have this expectation that my expenses will be a little bit lower, but not significantly so. For my food expenses, I'm gonna put $300. Transportation, do have to go to and from places. If I am looking for work, I would have to drive somewhere more often than not, and just any sort of driving that you have to do in order to live your day-to-day life. So this is where transportation comes in. I don't drive a significant amount currently, so I'm not spending a ton of money on this. So I have found that $100 usually gets me where I need to go. For my car insurance, this one is tricky because oftentimes you can only base your emergency fund on what your current expenses are, but I know in the future that there's a high chance that my car insurance will just keep going up in price, because that is what I've experienced more or less so far. It's gone down a little bit, but with inflation, they've started raising the prices a bit. So it's something to keep in mind is that with this emergency fund, yes, I do have a goal, like an end goal, but as your expenses change, like if you move to a different apartment, if you get a different car, anything like that, anything that can change what your monthly bills are, you need to make sure you account for that and adjust your emergency fund accordingly. As of now, I'm paying about $92 a month in my car insurance. For my dog Cece, in the pet category, I of course wanted to cover her pet deductible or her pet insurance deductible, but I also have to pay for her expenses that are not related to medical issues at all. So her food, other stuff, I'm sure I'm completely blanking, but like at least I have to cover her food. So I'm gonna hope for like $100. It should be a good amount to budget for. For my subscriptions, I do have a few different subscriptions. I don't have so many that I feel like I would need to cut back on them in the case of an emergency. Of course, it would depend on how dire everything is or how big of an emergency we're talking about. But for me, I'm only spending $28 on subscriptions, and these are things like Spotify and Apple Care, and I'm probably going to continue doing that even in an emergency. Medical expenses, I'm going to keep this pretty simple with $100, and for auto, I'm going to do $50. I've been keeping up with my auto expenses, so I'm not too concerned about that. And if there was an accident, that would fall under my auto insurance deductibles. So I'm thinking for actual like auto maintenance, $50 a month would be okay. For student loans, something I've been thinking about is if I had a job loss, what would I do with my student loans? I am fortunate enough to have only federal student loans, and they actually do have some pretty good payment flexibility when you are in a situation where you have no income or low income. Most likely, if I had a job loss, I would not be paying anything on my student loans because I could recalculate my income-driven repayment plan. So I do have this category here, but I'm very torn on whether or not I should actually account for it because of what I said. So if you have any thoughts on this, like should I include it, should I not, let me know. currently my student loan payment is $68 a month. If I have higher income, when I go to recertify, my monthly bill would most likely go up. If I have less income, it would go down. So I'm like, if I have less income, then I'm probably not making a huge payment on my student loans. But for the sake of creating the emergency fund, let's just assume it's going to be the same amount as what I have now, which is about $68. Finally, for miscellaneous, I just wanted to have a catch-all category because when I was first looking at this, if you notice the total says it's only $1,500 a month. What that told me is I really have kept my monthly bills or my monthly commitment quite low when it comes to what's required for me to pay. So I've already paid off my car loan, so I'm not worried about making monthly. I don't have to account for the monthly payments on that. If you were making your emergency fund, you would definitely want to make sure any debt payments you have are being covered under your calculation because you still have to pay on those, most likely even if you are in an emergency situation. That being said, I definitely spend more than $1,500 a month on average, and since it's my emergency fund, I want to make sure I build in some buffer room in order to account for expenses I'm not considering, random things that pop up. Who knows, like if I lose my job and I'm looking for a new job, maybe there's clothing expenses. I want to make sure I capture this in some sort of way in a flexible sort of category, so that's why I have miscellaneous here. I'm just torn on if it should be $200 or $300, and I'm kind of leaning towards $300. So that puts my total monthly expenses for my emergency fund at $1,860. At 3 months, that means it'd be $5,580, and at 6 months, it'd be $10,854. So now let's add it all together and see how much money I need to save. Taking a look here, I'm gonna take the I can't do basic math. So $1,860. Should I just continue to round this up to $2,000? What do we think? Maybe just build in even more of a buffer room. $2,000 is still not a huge monthly expense, so I could probably save for it. So let's do $2,000. So 3 months would be $6,000. My deductibles, as we established, were $4,750. So the total at 3 months is $10,750. At 6 months, I would need $12,000 for monthly expenses, and the deductibles would supposedly stay the same. So for $4,750, which makes my 6-month emergency fund $16,750. Now let's talk about my timeline for reaching this goal. So like I mentioned at the beginning of the video, I only have about $8,600, I believe, in my current emergency fund. So it's not bad, but it's not exactly where I want to be. I do have a pretty stable job situation at the moment, so I'm not particularly concerned about losing my job. I do have some money anxieties, so I want to make sure I'm still prioritizing this in my budget, but it's not necessarily like a number one high priority goal. So how that's played out so far this year is I've been putting $167 a month into my emergency fund category. So at the end of the year, I should have a total of $10,000. So it really just comes down to, do I want to stretch my way into the $16,750 amount? When I first created this, or when I was first running the numbers, my brain kept telling me, oh, I want to save $15,000. That would be a good amount. But I didn't really know why, or it wasn't really a number that I had any sort of facts or data to go on. But now that I've gone through and actually calculated it out, I do think $15,000 would be a decent amount for my emergency fund. And with the caveat of often, like I mentioned, you are not having every single emergency at once. So the likelihood that like your car would break down or be in an accident, you have a medical catastrophe, you lose your job, your pet gets very sick, and a tree hits your home is very, very low. So you have to keep that in mind, that this money is ultimately pretty flexible for what your goals are. So all that to be said, I am hoping I can hit the $10,750 amount at the end of this year. So if you want to see how I'm doing with my emergency fund progress, definitely subscribe and stick around. And then for 6 months, I think that would just really depend on how my financial goals go throughout the year. So going back to their financial order of operations, let me move this. Step 4 is about where I'm at, but I'm also working on step 5 a bit. Specifically, I am contributing to my Roth IRA in addition to my employer match. And that's because I want to make sure I have some tax-free growth. I hope I'm saying that right, because I've already paid taxes on the contributions. So when I withdraw the money in my eventual retirement, it. I'm not gonna have to pay taxes on it, and all of the money that's in my employer match or in my pension is pre-tax contributions, so that will be taxed at retirement. So I'm trying to come up with a good blend of pre-tax and post-tax retirement income. What I mean by that is I am working towards my emergency fund, but I'm also trying to put about 5 to 6% of my gross income into my Roth and HSA. So I think honestly, once you're past like the first 3 steps on the financial order of operations, you are kind of working on 4, 5, and maybe 6 simultaneously, at least in my opinion. Your mileage may vary, so that's where I'm at with this. Now I want to hear from you. Let me know what you are working on. If you are working on your emergency fund, how many months are you trying to save for? Are you getting close to your goal? I would love to hear about it. If you like this video, please like it. It really helps out my channel. If you want to see more budgeting content, subscribe so you can stick around. And if you have been watching my channel, I hope you like this video because this is kind of a different video for me. I don't always do something like this, so I hope you enjoyed it. But otherwise, I will see you all in the next one. Bye now.